The more we learn about the Kerryn Phelps Medevac laws passed before the election with Labor's support and that of former MPs like Darren Hinch, the worse it gets. Despite what we were told at the time, this law was not about bringing doctors into the process of approving boat people to come to Australia for medical treatment. That's because doctors have always had a role. The difference between the situation before this law and the situation after it is that before the law, doctors advised the government. Now it's the activist doctors who make the decision on whether someone will come to Australia for treatment, not the politicians. We elect to do this job, armed with expert medical advice, but also advice from security agencies. And, of course, the government's commitment not to restart the people smuggling trade. For some of these medicos, I've got to say, opening new channels for backdoor immigration almost seems as though it's their primary aim. Under Labor's law, any two doctors can sign off the taxpayer-funded evacuation of asylum seekers to Australia. Excuse me. And highlighted at the time, there's no requirement, of course, that these doctors personally examine the patients either. Again, as we said, this would be the case last year when these laws were being debated. Anyone who comes to Australia under the Medevac laws are here forever, rather than, as before, facing the prospect of returning to Manus or Nauru, or indeed home once treatment had finished. Thanks to a Senate hearing yesterday, we now know that over 130 boat people have been brought to Australia, allegedly because it was impossible for them to get adequate health care on Manus Island or Nauru. That's despite the dozens of Australian health staff we as taxpayers provide and the outstanding hospital that Australia paid to upgrade. A hospital, I have to say, that's better than you'd find in most rural or regional communities here in Australia. Now, of the 130 Medevac arrivals under Labor's legislation, less than 10% were ever actually hospitalised. And as of now, tonight, not one of them is in hospital. And yet, you guessed it, all of them are still here in Australia and not one has returned. Worse, and here's the kicker, of the 130 asylum seekers transferred to Australia, nearly half have actually refused treatment or diagnostic tests such as chest x-rays. So you're sick, two doctors who don't even examine you sign you off to come to Australia for urgent medical treatment, yet when you're here, you refuse that treatment. Begs the question, doesn't it? That the reason you refuse the treatment is because you're worried people might actually find out you're not sick in the first place. But it gets worse. Almost 10% of those coming here under Labor's laws have had adverse security advice or failed the character test. So let's call a spade a shovel. This bill was never about proper healthcare for boat people. It was about giving boat people backdoor entry to Australia. It was Labor deliberately weakening our border protection laws to have an each-way bet with Greens voters going into the election rather than outwardly saying what they really were intending to do, which was dismantle the so-called bipartisanship between the Coalition and Labor. You would think, wouldn't you, that after failing to win the unlosable election, Labor would be reconsidering all of its Green left positions, from tax to climate change to border protection. But it's not. It's still dithering on tax, it's still subscribes to the climate cult, and it's now doubling down on its support for the so-called Medevac laws, thanks to its Open Borders spokeswoman, Christina Keneally. Now, you know I've been a critic of Keneally's tin ear on policy for some time and her appallingly poor political judgment. But while I was on leave last week, I wasn't surprised to see that many of her own colleagues feel as I do, given the leaks against her and people feeling that she's damaging Labor's credibility in this critical Home Affairs portfolio. But again, it got worse. Worse for Labor and worse for Senator Keneally. Today, a poll published in the Australian newspaper showed that almost 60% of people want so-called Islamic State brides and their children kept out of Australia indefinitely. Keneally, though, well, she not only wants the boat people and Madison Nauru brought here, she also thinks that we have a moral duty, her words, not mine, to rescue Australians out of Syria, even though all of them, every single one of these women, went there to join a terrorist organisation fighting against Australian troops and fighting against Australian values. And now, of course, they're using their children as pawns to come back home. I'm sorry, but children or not, this is the bed you lie in, ladies, literally and figuratively, when you leave Australia with the single intention of becoming Islamic State fighters' wives to breed the cubs of the caliphate. All of this is a real mess for Labor. As one of my Labor contacts said this afternoon, the longer Anthony Albanese lasts, the better Bill Shorten looks. Now, it's early days, but I reckon it's headed in that direction.